ぬかけらに力うつく炎だ誰を求めるこの手叫ぶ君の心知らぬままにたくさん忘れておくれ望むだけじゃ無理とまだ痛みにうろたえる赤い赤い羽が落ちるけどめてどうか逃げないで全て失う定め持ちながら希望が未来を焼き尽くしてもう一度の意味がまた蘇る輝くゆえに見失う夢命飛ばす最後のエデン
Hello and welcome to TheBlueShifting. If you're joining us live, I'm looking forward to seeing any of your comments that you might be putting down. You can ask me questions, you can just kind of make comments on what I say, and I'll try and bring them up as we're going. If you're watching this later and afterwards, thank you for joining us. It is always a pleasure to be able to bring you some kind of... I love it, these rap parties, and I still just love the name for them, but all in all, happy to be here and be able to share kind of like our resolution of this game. Now we're almost 60 episodes in. I guess you could count this as the 60th episode, but yeah, after almost 60 episodes, we've been able to go from episode 0 to episode 3, which frankly ended much more positive note than I expected. Mostly I think that comes from the fact that there's more to the story to be told. So that's obvious that they have something else that they could be doing the work for, but you know, we'll have to see when the timetable will be and if we'll get a simultaneous release of something new, or if we're going to have to wait for a translation like we have for most all the other titles in Muv-Luv. But considering the trajectory we've seen with the other projects from Anchor and like the Muv-Luv franchise, I would hope that they would keep that trend of kind of trying to simultaneously release things, or at least somewhat simultaneous. Much better than they had in the past. Again, we often can take for granted just how accessible visual novels have started to become. It used to be kind of a chore, and a lot of times people had to do fan translations. We still depend on the fan translations a lot. We owe them a lot, honestly, because I think the fan translations paved the way for proving that there was a market outside Japan that were interested in these wonderful stories. But regardless of that, that's all overhang. Now let's get talking to the meat and potatoes of this game. Series as a whole. I think one of my favorite aspects, actually, is the fact that episode 0 was so tangential to the story. Like, it was so foundational, but I had no idea it was actually, like, gonna be so foundational to the ending. Like, I knew that JFK was important. Lilia's involvement and all the falling of the friends she made there, some of the best characters in this entire arc, was really impactful and important. But to realize that in episode 3, like, the main climax was going to be revolving around the remains of the JFK and her crew was really brilliant and something I really was excited to see. Oh, James Brown. Will Total Eclipse be following from this? Total Eclipse consumes good years of my life, and the one I'll be curious to see what you make of it. We'll get to that. I always announce what my next series is going to be at the end of the rap party. Like, I usually just play the trailer for whatever we're going to be jumping into, but so just, if you stick around, I promise we'll get to it. But I'm going to focus on the day after for the minute. So, anyway, the fact that it was so impactful, because until between the end of episode 0 and like the occasional mentions of the JFK incident and the second half of episode 3, we had almost no inclination about how critical the JFK was going to be, really. which I thought was really well done narratively, because we got so caught up in the politics and the people and like the devastation of the world post-Babylon disaster. It almost became, it kind of made the beta almost like this side, like diversion, this kind of like nebulous problem that just wasn't forefronted our minds, which is exactly what the writers were trying to communicate of how silly that is. We have extraterrestrials literally trying to wipe the planet clean of us still, after we did literally the most destructive thing to the planet, trying to wipe them out, literally like doing so much damage to the planet that a very, very small portion of the planet that had been survivable and populated by people was now gone. And they were still around and still a threat, and yet it took a back seat to the politics, which I think is exactly like really what it was talking about. Like what this whole narrative's ultimately branching about is talking about how people are people regardless. Like even with a common enemy, a thing you think would unite us more than anything. Well, technically it does, but at the same time, we're still as divisive and like selfish, and selfish in the positive and negative sense. Like I think there's reasonable selfishness. I think you need to take care of yourself, you need to take care of your family, standing up for the things that you find valuable and of note and of value. Like it makes sense that you'd be willing to fight for them. It sucks because like I could have people in the audience listening to this right now who are on opposite sides of political conflicts right now. The ideologies of our nations could be completely at odds. They could even be like at blows at some point. They could have been in the past and might be in the future. Hopefully not. But the idea is that we can all have so much in common. We often have so much in common, and yet we can still find reasons to fight each other. So I think it's a very good like narrative to be reading about because it gets you to think, and especially in the current climate, I think the day after is a very good story to be telling in the world we are currently living in. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this kind of comes together in the future and seeing what's going to be brought about. But I'm excited to see what the potential of the story comes in to focus later, and if we're going to get a kind of a resolution arc, which is kind of what I'm guessing that the next part would be, because the Babylon disaster, I've talked about it a lot because it was very impactful. I think of all the events of the day after, seeing the Babylon like disaster and its effects has been the part of this whole story that really captured my heart and like my attention the most. Just the imagination and theory crafting for me that goes into like the what ifs about what happened and like how it happened and what was going on. Like I find that to be incredibly engaging. Again, I think this comes from my love of science and physics, and trying to anticipate and understand this idea that they were building of a world that has killed itself essentially. And that's kind of what I ultimately think is the fate. Like I've said it before, especially towards the end, but I still stand by my ground. Like I'm so happy that the characters we fell in love with survived, that they were able to be successful in taking a hive, that they came out mostly unhurt the other side, with a lot of things being able to be resolved. But I don't think that they live in a world that can be successful. I can't see this planet having a future where humanity can actually survive. Even before Babylon, like when the beta had overrun so much of the world, I was skeptical if humanity could come back from that. But having seen this, I'm more convinced than ever that we were much better off before Alternative 5. Which is exactly why Yuko-sensei was so determined to avoid it, because she saw it coming a mile away and she theorized about it, which is like, it's funny how much like her estimations became so critical to this game and to the narrative because she was so right. It's really interesting to see a lot of that, and it's almost like, again, like this story despite the fact that it's in a timeline that's essentially been, sacrificed, like a timeline that isn't canon, or at least not, it's the rejected timeline. There's an argument to be said that it exists somewhere, but like even for a non-canon branch of the Muv-Luv Universe, it really tells a very compelling, powerful story that I think was not only, like, I imagine when this was first being pitched, there were probably a lot of people who were like, why would we need this story? Because I kind of wanted to think that myself. Like, when I first was reading this, I was like, well, this is kind of cool, but, like, is this really going to be adding a whole lot? And frankly, yeah, it does. It's interesting because it's like a different Altered Fable. I called Altered Fable, which was the post-alternative after story, you could say. I called that a love letter to the fans, because it was after all the grueling, heart-wrenching, intense storytelling and crafting that we'd been going through for years at that point. You finally get this story where it took all these lovable characters and it finally gave you a chance to just enjoy yourself with them. To just have a good, wholesome, dating visual novel. And like, with the context of all the side stories and everything put together, and like all the horrors that we had witnessed in all these different tellings and everything, it really was a boon. It was so delicious, and it's something that like you could you could try and explain that to somebody who has no idea about the series, and they'd never get it. They'd never understand why that's such a precious game. I argue that The Day After is the same thing. It's a love letter to the fans of Muv-Luv, but it's not in the sense of a relief, of a place where you can go and just kind of have a good time. Instead, it's a love letter to the characters and the world that they lived in, but seen through perspectives and through lenses that are a little different. Where Muv-Luv's greatest strength was its characters, one of its greatest weaknesses was also its character, specifically a specific character, I'd argue, Takaru. I love Takaru, and he's a great character, and his growth arc through all extra, unlimited, and then alternative is fantastic. But we always got things through his perspective, and he was always central focused, laser focused primarily on saving the timeline. It kind of was his duty as the recycled hero to do so. And that focus was great because we got to see a lot of character growth from him. But it meant that the world moved a lot around him, and we only kind of saw effects of that movement and heard about it. The Day After, I think, is a love letter to the fans because it dives so much into the stuff that was going on in the background of Alternative and Unlimited, but fleshed out, brought to the forefront, and we really got to see the moving pieces. Like the Royal Guard takeover of the government, which is what Salgari and his uprisers were trying to fight against. They saw it coming, and they were trying to stop it. Seeing it follow through, and seeing what it was they were fighting against. Seeing Marimo like elevated beyond an instructor and given a chance to kind of shine, and seeing her be successful, but then eventually being devoured by the very politics that she was trying to defend. And like seeing just the idea of a humanity that was left behind being forced to like find hope in the face of the terrible things that were done in the name of destroying the enemy. James Brown says, Wei Luxian, the writer of The Day After, has a degree in international relations, and you can tell how his world building works. It's got a very different flavor to it. I agree. And I think, like I said, it's so important that we got to have a perspective like this, because it was something that definitely wasn't a focus in the story around Takaru. It was absolutely happening. It was referenced, it was charted, it was accounted for, but it was essentially it was almost like an antagonist of sorts, because it was like stuff that was interfering with Alternative 4. It was stuff that was interfering with Yoko Sensei, but she was the one dealing with most of that, letting Takaru essentially focus on his tasks alone, which is great because Takaru really needed to. But being able to have this more worldwide perspective, and from the eyes of someone who just genuinely, like, it's not just like you can get a degree in whatever you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you could understand and write it in a way that's compelling. Way definitely does that. This, like, the day after, I think is compelling through and through the entire time. Even at the height of the political machinations in any of the episodes, I found it to be engaging. It always felt like there was something going on that I couldn't quite see, but I could just barely get the inkling of. And yet there was also enough for me to sink my teeth into that I could sit and talk about it. I also really like how, especially by the time we get to episode 3, the character who's like the primary like antagonist, essentially, who is like His Excellency, Ikaraka, like, I kept having to say, I genuinely don't like this guy, but I can't say he's wrong. The best villains are the ones that you can't help but agree with a little bit, you know? Like, did he do the right thing? Probably in the eyes of a national crisis, but on a moral sense, no. It's like, you kind of have to hate him for the choices that he's made, but you also can't fault that he was absolutely right to make the choices that he made, considering the information he had. And it's aggravating, but I love it. That's one of the greatest, I think one of the greatest signs of writing, is that you can't even hate the people who are your, like you're positioned to find the most antagonistic. Even the French, like, they did so much garbage in these series, and were so aggravating, especially when they freaking, like, took over NORAD and bombed, like, you know, the American soil. Like, that stuff is crazy. But I totally get why they did it, and I totally understand. They were being bananas, and I definitely think that out of the two sides, I definitely think that the best side, quote unquote, won. But you can't just sit here and say, like, oh, the French were just insane. Like, they weren't. They were just trying to survive. And when you're put up against a wall and you have people screaming because they're starving to death, and they're your people and you care about them, of course you're gonna do crazy stuff if you believe genuinely it's going to make their lives better and going to provide for them in ways like to save your family, like in the literal sense and in the existential sense of, like, your kingdom and your nation and your nationality. Which kind of brings us around to the characters that we get to see. Is like, during all the machinations, I loved how the main characters, the core cast, each kind of had a unique placement within, like, the scope of the world and the building. Like, Hibiki's the son of a fisher. He's just like a gung-ho guy who's pretty good at his job, who became, like, because of his, like, qualifications and his training and the fact that he was able to survive all the craziness, meant that he became a very critical person in this post-Babylon world, where before he probably was just kind of like he wasn't of special note before the disaster. But then after the disaster, when the world needed, like, some of the toughest and most intense heroes, Hibiki rose up because he was, while maybe a more simple individual, he also was a pure person. Somebody who didn't give up and was always willing to do what it took to make things work. And that is something that this world desperately needs, which is why now it becomes pretty clear that that his people rallied around him, both in the, like, political sense, but also just in the general sense. So, like, Hibiki is a fantastic, shining character, and he makes a great foil for Takeru, who everyone who plays this game is going to compare him to, which is why it was such a treat, too, to have them both be so involved in the ultimate climax of episode 3. Because, again, that's a heralding story, like, that's a salute to the fans of this series. We all like Takeru, at least in the sense that, like, we follow his character so passionately. And to see Hibiki, whom is also a Takeru-like character, yet his own character, like, he's not a clone or a replica of Takeru, he's his own person, but you get a similar kind of, like, love and attachment from him as a protagonist. To have him and Takeru end up fighting together is really great, which is kind of why I made the prediction that, like, in the finale, whatever this is, I could see them actually fighting each other, because that would be super hard, because how would we pick who we want to win? Like, that would be horrible. And that's why I think it's going to happen. James, you continue saying, Hibiki's unique in the franchise as the only MC who's not a fighting ace. Hakaru, Yuya, and Theodore are ace pilots. Hibiki is an officer, a leader. Gives him a unique slant that really stands out. I kind of agree. Like, Hibiki isn't like, he's not a Takaru in the sense that he's like an insane pilot, but he's clearly skilled. His greatest asset is his determination, and when in the face of danger, I would say his fearlessness, but that's not entirely correct because he's absolutely filled with fear. It's the fact that he's willing to follow through despite his fear that makes him truly incredible. Like, it's the thing that makes it so that he's willing to charge and to stick, to be the one to stick a bomb in the mouth of the giant burrowing beta. It makes him the kind of person who's willing to fly into the middle of a fire zone, like a war zone, get out of his mech and stand like undefended, calling for peace. It's the same kind of thing that makes it so that when the crap was hitting the fan in the middle of the hive and they were so close to their goal that he was willing to throw everything on the line to try and make it so that he could survive and get to the point where they could make the difference that was necessary to bring about the end of the fighting. Hibiki is a fantastic pilot and he's a fantastic hero, but you're right, he's not like incredibly skilled. He's incredibly determined and probably incredibly lucky. Like, there's got to be a call out to the fact that he has some very good fortune. Like, there's some gods watching over him or something, because like it's kind of ridiculous what he's managed to pull through. But that he also has like kind of been on a journey about like maintaining his humanity, which is something that's really cool. So Hibiki, as a character and as a main character, is fantastic. He's a very worthy addition to the Muv-Luv franchise. I'm really excited to see what happens to him in the future, and I think that he is somebody who I am invested in personally, heavily, despite his flaws. Like, he's got the best kind of flaws, which are the flaws that make him feel very human and real. Then let's talk to Yuzuka. So Yuzuka is interesting because, like, again, we're talking about how like everyone in the squad kind of reflects a different aspect of the overall political situation, right? And she's descended, unlike Hibiki, who descended from a farmer, a fisher. Sorry, not a farmer. A fisher. She came from a very prominent family, a very well-off family. She likely was able to avoid the draft, so she like never was required to fight. But she chose to fight because she wanted to do something different, wanted to prove herself, wanted to contribute. Sorry, real quick, James, you said the name for the possible next entry, resonative, is named after Hibiki, as Hibiki in Japanese reads to resonate or to vibrate. Ah, interesting. That'll be cool to see. Anyway, so Yuzuka, like, she's really interesting because her arc is so unique in the sense that we kind of see her story backwards, where she immediately impressed me coming out the gate. I think it was pretty clear she was top waifu material of the squad. I know there's a lot of Ellen fans, and I definitely know why you're fans. She's really great, but I still think Yuzuka was top girl from the beginning, and I felt that way all the way through. Mostly. There's an exception. We'll get to that. But for now, know that Yuzuka was my favorite of the squad. I don't think she was my main girl of the whole thing, and I'm sure anyone listening to this probably knows where I'm going with that, but anyway, I want to focus on Yuzuka. But her character arc, like I said, was backwards, where we focused so much on Hibiki in episode 1. Yuzuka was kind of like his pillar of strength, his fallback. Like, she was there by his side, constantly making sure that he was grounded and able to stay focused. And she made sure that he made it through no matter what. And she was just the perfect, like wingman, literally. Like, she was just fantastic. But then, as we go to episode 2, and Hibiki starts to dive more into his memories, we see that she's carrying a very heavy burden. And even if Hibiki doesn't quite see it like fully by the end, he starts having an appreciation for it. But even us as readers, it was very clear that she was carrying a burden of some kind, something terrible, something like overwhelming. But she pushed on, and she reminded me very much of Maya, who of course was my favorite girl of the main series. But she reminds me of her in the fact that she seems able to kind of take on these great burdens and internalize them in a way that she doesn't lose sight of the people closest to her. Now, it's not healthy, like she definitely needed to be able to process those emotions, and she kind of was holding it back, but at the same time, like, she gave room for Hibiki to become the man he needed to be by holding that stuff in for a while. So she was just as important and a hero as Hibiki in a lot of ways. And I think she was critical to him surviving. Remember how, like, she talked about on the journey west, how everyone started to fray. But it was interesting because Hibiki was the opposite, where he had frayed at the beginning, but as they were moving west and people started to fall apart, he kind of collected himself and kind of became the rock of the group. And she clung to him in that sense, and she preserved him, because I think she needed him as much as he ended up needing her. Because if he went away, I think she would have lost it. Especially with the Asagi, is that right? Asami or Asagi, like his girlfriend at the time, and when she snapped. That revelation was harsh, by the way. I think that was a cruel thing, though, to take the kind of running joke of Yuzuka, like, overreacting and being overly protective of Hibiki and always breaking into his room when he was, like, yelling, with an axe. And, like, that was a funny running joke. I was like, oh, she's dangerous with an axe. I featured her prominently in, like, thumbnails with her wielding this axe, you know, on, like, this kind of running thing. And then you get to episode 3, and it's like, yeah, turned out axe is kind of a signature weapon of hers, and it's pretty important, which kind of makes, like, it makes it so much more impactful. But then at the same time, it kind of makes it really weird that she runs into Hibiki's room swinging an axe wildly. Like, I don't know. I feel like she would be hesitant to want to be, like, I feel like she would want to stay away from axes because of those memories, instead of jumping to them as her main weapon of choice. I don't know. I wonder if that's something we're going to explore more. I doubt it. I think it just was, like, I think it was mostly just a writing trick. This idea of taking a kind of a running gag and turning it into a horror. You know, it's a really good way to kind of make that impact have, like, a more punch than ever. And I think it's really great, but, like, it still is like, ugh. But it was absolutely, like, it's absolutely well done. And I'm very happy that, like, we got to see that narrative and that story branch out and how it works. So, Yuzuka, great, like, top girl. I'm happy that they ended up together. They look like they're going to be really happy. And it definitely kind of implied that, like, they might have already, like, started a family. But again, that might have just been a throwaway thing. I'm not sure if that's something that's going to actually be followed through. But it would be interesting to see an idea of, like, confronting the reality of, like, bringing a life into the world when there's so much, like, when the world is so garbage. Like, I think that could be an interesting story to explore. But we'll have to see. I don't know. It might be a bit too much for a series to like this to touch on, and I imagine there's some pretty extenuating things that happen to prevent that from occurring, you know, accidentally, like, as in, like, contraceptives being part of your food, like something you don't get to choose whether you're on or not. Like, it's something that's, like, you are on if you're in the military, because it kind of makes sense. Like, if you have valuable, like, pilots, you can't have them being, like, suddenly taken off the front like that, like, unexpectedly. Like, I think family planning is critical in a time like this. So, it was an implication. I just don't know if there's going to be follow through on that, or if it was just, like, something, you know, if it legitimately was just, like, seasickness, even though she hadn't had seasickness before that, really. And she'd been on boats a lot before. And so her suddenly getting seasick was a little odd. Anyway, Yuzuka, good girl. Now Ellen. Now her place in the story is interesting. She's the foreigner, the Canadian/French person who defected to Japan. Now there is a side story about her being a chicken diver, well, not chicken diver, just an orbital diver. Chicken diver, she'd done it 5 times. I think that was supposed to be her first mission. And I didn't choose to read that because I'm going to hold on to hope that perhaps it will be released. Like, if they release Resonative, I could see them releasing some of the side stories associated with the day after with it. Because that seems like kind of in line with the way that they've handled stuff before this. Which might be why it hasn't been translated yet. I think it might be because it's satellite to this series, that it might be packaged together. So I'm kind of just going to hold out and hope that I can just actually read it. But it is available, and people have provided links before to see it, and I'm sure it's fantastic. So I hope if you get the chance, go ahead and read it. Just don't spoil it for me. But I do know that she was an orbital diver. Somehow she was able to get down safely. And when she did, she likely just did whatever she could to survive, which meant joining up with the Japanese. Despite the fact that afterwards she probably realized, oh, like, I guess my people are okay. But I imagine at the time she really just was desperate to find, like, some hope. You know, because that's what the series is really a lot about, is hope. James, you say again, they didn't release Teto Moyu with Total Eclipse, so I really doubt The Last Divers is coming anytime soon. Yeah, like I said, I was saying I think it would be released with Resonative, if that comes out. I could see them packaging it with that, because with Total Eclipse, it kind of would be out of place, because Total Eclipse takes place in the alternative timeline, if I understand correctly. So packaging something that takes place in the unlimited timeline would be a little odd. I think if they release Resonative, I imagine that side story would be included in that pack as part of a, like, hey, this is some background material that might be important for content that we explore with Ellen in that story. So we'll see about that. But with her kind of having to play this role of like being a foreigner in times when, like, everyone, like, there's not enough resources to go around, and open hostilities between the different nations, like, that's a very tough place to be, because you get judged. I imagine it's something that we saw really heavily reflected in America and probably in most of the world after 9/11, for people who were of Arab and surrounding nation nationalities, were practicers of Islam, especially if they were dressing in the traditional garb and adhering to their religious practices. It was a tough time because there was a lot of hostility about people who were willing to do so much destruction to our country here in America. It spills over into a kind of a general hatred of anything that reminds you of that, and people can also use it as a fuel to motivate already existing biases. And it's really sad because there's a lot of innocent people that get caught up in those heavy emotions, and it still happens to this day. It's shocking to me that we're living in a world where it's not uncommon to have at least one yearly, like, racially or religiously motivated, bigoted, like, attack. Like, America, of course, we always have way too many gun-related mass shootings, but a lot of them tend to be either targeted specifically at specific groups of people, like personal people, like this person snaps and they go after specific targets. It's still terrible. Or it tends to just be like a random thing, like they literally go somewhere random where they just expect to find a lot of people and just try and do as much damage as possible. Both absolutely terrible. But mixed into that, there are bigoted assaults that happen too, that are racially or religiously motivated, and that breaks my heart because it's so derivative of this type of attitude that because you perceive a certain group of like a group that harbors people that hurt you in one way or another, even if it's a misconception, you decide that all of them are guilty. And that's just so sad. But it's something we see with Ellen. Maybe not too badly, because people like aren't openly attacking Ellen. But at the same time, we see how, like, from the first episode, even Marimo's like, keep an eye on her. Like, there's a built-in suspicion that came with Ellen. And it colored and likely made it difficult for her to even comfortably make friends with people beyond Miono and the rest of the squad, but specifically Miono. Because Miono was so young, she wasn't inclined to hold on to a lot of these, like, built-in nationalistic attitudes, which is why they made such good friends, I think, and why they made such a good companion for each other. Because Miono wanted somebody to learn from, and was moving from an orphanage to somewhere where, like having siblings in that orphanage, and ended up kind of getting a big sister in Ellen, because she's like her family was whoever she was working with. Rotfinger, you say, I think I'm gonna buy it myself on Steam and read it from chapter 0. If you haven't read this yet, you absolutely need to not be here. This is spoiler central. But yeah, though, these are fantastic. This is a surprisingly, like, moving and powerful Muv-Luv story that's absolutely, like, it's not the series. If you don't expect it to do what Alternative did, which was literally like change my life, but my goodness, that this series absolutely worth it. It's a very worthy addition to the Muv-Luv storyline and absolutely worth reading. Anyway, so Ellen's position being kind of like the foreigner that's been kind of brought in was almost like a microcosm of also what was essentially having to happen with Japan in the United States, France with Canada, and I would say humanity itself with the tiny square mileage that was still survivable. It's about, like, you have to have all these people where it's like, you have very limited access and resources, you just gotta come together. And it's not about, like, it's mostly about, like, just survival. And, like, it's sad that, like, even in those times, we get so caught up in the way we feel about, like, politics and religion and nationality and history, that, like, why do we let it color things so much? Like, it's human nature, it's kind of just something we deal with, but it still sucks, you know? So, Ellen's story is really powerful in that regard. It was also really sad. Like, I understand her falling for Hibiki. I think one of the biggest reasons why she didn't end up with Hibiki was likely because Hibiki was not seeing the signs. But I think that a lot of that had to do with him personally. I don't think he was ready. I think he had so much he was still, like, suppressively, like, dealing with. Like, even in his subconscious. I genuinely don't think he could have moved forward with his relationship with anybody until he got that, like, resolved. I think the only time that she really had a chance was shortly after Yuzuka, like, opened up to Hibiki and kind of, like, explained the reality of what happened with, like, her story, and with, like, the journal that she, Asagi's journal. That was kind of where he really kind of came to terms with everything and finally was able to move forward. I imagine there's still more to be revealed. I still think there's a suspiciously large amount of time and a very not accounted for amount of food that I think was involved in the survival of Hibiki and Yuzuka, but, like, maybe they're saving that for the next part. Because I reading between the lines, it kind of became pretty obvious. I'm like, there was some special jerky going on there, and I honestly think Yuzuka was the one who probably took care of all that. So, yeah, I imagine that's another big burden to have to go through. But regardless of that, Ellen, I think it's sad to see that her love was unrequited. I still have to argue, though, that, like, in the face of, like, imminent, like, annihilation of humanity, if there is a chance to try and, like, find peace and try and rebuild properly, if there is still that dichotomy where there's a lot more girls to guys ratio-wise, and the population's this devastated but needs to be replenished, it's a weird to say, but I had a whole spiel about it, but I still argue, like, it's, like, the only time I could justify, like, true polygamist like relationships because it's like, look, you're gonna end up with a lot of people who could be having families who just don't have that chance because there's just not enough people to go around if you keep things monogamous. And it'd be really weird, and you'd have to be careful because the big problem with these cults that pop up that have like polygamous stuff is that it's all a power trip, and they use like the excuse of like their religious beliefs to do really terrible things, essentially human trafficking, but in a way that they can somehow justify because of religious belief. That's the wrong thing about it. But like, if it really came down to it, I could see like Hibiki being able to be with Ellen as long as Yuzuka approved, of course. But again, we're talking extremes, we're not talking ideals, and we're not talking something that's super relatable, so I don't know if they're going to talk about that. It's a heavy topic, but at the same time, I really am curious to see how things are going to happen and move forward with Ellen. I really hope that if we get to see more of her future, that she gets to find someone she can be happy with, and that she gets to have her own arc and her own joy. Because she deserves it. She's a wonderful person, a wonderful character. And then we'll go to lovely Miono, which is great. One thing I really thought was good about Miono is the fact that, like, while she kind of reminded me a lot of Tama, where Tama kind of played up the role of the childlike character, which it's sad because I love Tama as a character, but as a caricature, she definitely was problematic. Where not only did she have a more childlike appearance, but she also had a childlike demeanor, which just kind of seems to play into a certain type of fetish that's really questionable. Like, you know, it's one of those things where like there are genuine adults that can have very childlike and youthful appearances, but at the same time, like, if you're playing to that or as a fetish, it's kind of getting close to dangerous territory. So I'm always wary when that stuff pops up. Not a deal breaker for a character, but it makes me... I reserve judgment usually. But I really like how Miono, because she is really young. Like, she's the youngest in the group, so she's like 14, right? And while she probably has like a bit of an infatuation with Hibiki, it's never brought up as like an actual thing. Like, she's never brought up as an actual contender for like a relationship. And when the relationship starts, we didn't have this like Ellen had like a whole arc where she had to kind of like obviously deal with the reality of like not being able to be with Hibiki and how that actually ended up hurting, you know, because she genuinely had fallen for him. But Miono didn't have an arc like that. And while she probably has caught feelings for him, it likely was a crush because she's still really, really young. And so I like how they kept it in that scope. And she's kind of like the little sister of the entire group, like of their little family. And I love that. I just think it's a good, very wholesome way to approach things. I even like that they hadn't played up a little joke about it where she like, it was like she was confessing her feelings to Hibiki in episode 1. But it turned out it was just her trying to express her gratitude for like him, like keeping her alive and like helping her to become a better pilot. But she just didn't know how to do it properly, so she did a letter because Ellen kind of encouraged her to do it as a joke because it would come across like it might be a confession, but it wasn't a confession at all. She just like wasn't sure how to express herself, and so she just did it in a letter format. I thought that was really cute, a fun play on the tropes that you see. And then I loved her growth and arc in general as a character, like how when it came to fighting General Beta and even fighting people, she was competent, she was actually very good and very skilled and very much kept her cool. But when it came to fighting Laser Class, which were always the most terrifying thing on the battlefield when you're fighting Beta, and something she'd never had to fight or engage with, that really like impacted her because it was something that was just so terrifying and it really shook her to her core. I liked seeing that because I think that is something we didn't get a whole lot of, where it felt like most of the arcs we followed in the Muv-Luv series is either people who are just overwhelmed by everything and falling short in every way, or they're ace pilots who are just always like on top of their game, or even not even ace pilots, but like really skilled. And to have a character who was very skilled, but loses their confidence in the face of something that's so scary, like, is very humanizing. And like that arc was hard because it's like I genuinely was with the characters. I didn't know what was best for her, and to this day I don't know if there was anything that could have been done besides like her just kind of finding her own feet, but she did. Like I just like how it all played out, and I don't know if there was really anything that could have been done differently. And then finally we get to the end. Ultimately, like, just the story in general. I know it kind of stinks that I couldn't have an opportunity to read Total Eclipse before this, considering the railgun I know that it comes from the narrative, like the tie-in is from the narrative of Total Eclipse, because that's, again, like I talked about how earlier that The Day After is kind of a love story to the fans, but a more dramatic one, and a big part of that is the fact that we got to see so many like cameos from characters from all these different side stories, or even like just references of characters from different side stories all kind of together. Like a lot of you pointed out stuff that I missed in the final battle of various groups and various squads and such that we saw in like all the little side stories that we read in Photon Flowers and Photon Melodies. And then the railgun is apparently like something that is involved with the plot of like Total Eclipse. I really don't know at all. We'll find that out together someday, but like I just know that that's involved there somehow. And so like it would have been cool to be able to kind of have that wow factor that it was supposed to have, but I still had enough wow factor because it's like, man, like look at all these like names and characters, like Riviera, like I love, because like she was just a character who was referenced in a side story, and I thought immediately when she popped up there as a side, as like an aside like mention, I was like, she sounds cool. I want to know more about her. And to have her be a prominent person in episode 3 was really fun, because she was everything I thought she would be and more. She was fantastic. She's a fantastic character. I really enjoyed being able to see her. She's definitely one of my top characters of like all of like The Day After. I still think she gets beat out by a lot of the main cast of Alternative, but she's definitely up there in like of like of characters that I just was very much interested in and like very much would enjoy to learn more about. But when we come to the end of the story and we see all these kind of knots and strings come together, the ragtag remnants of the world that was, and having them all push through and actually be successful in capturing a beta hive without using G-bombs. It was very, very fulfilling in a way, because the closest we had to that was, you know, the finale of Alternative, and that was with the Susanoo. Granted, that was at the biggest hive on the planet and the most intelligent hive on the planet that could adapt to them on the fly, but it was still impressive. And if there was anything that made me hope that there could be a future for humanity in this timeline, it was the fact that they were able to accomplish that. I still think that they're doomed. It sounds pretty likely that there are surviving hives that are just probably underwater now, which just like, I don't know how you're going to deal with that. It just probably means that the beta are going to be forever a burden to the survivors. And it's like, maybe a flotilla city that like Ikuraga was talking about is the only solution. Even that, there's a lot of like problems with that. Major problems that I don't think can properly be resolved, and definitely not a long-term like ultimate solution. They're just kind of like a stopgate at most. The gravitational anomaly, I don't see it doing, like, it's got to resolve or the world's going to slowly start ripping itself apart. I think that the shearing forces that are going to be coming from that are going to start causing like massive earthquakes across the planet. It's just going to be a nightmare. You have the EMP distribution that like shuts down communications, and the big cloud that kind of orbits the planet. That's a disaster and a half. We don't know if the satellite defenses that try and prevent new beta hive like seeds, like from landing on the planet are going to be functional anymore, so we could have new hives, even if there aren't already still hives on the planet, which I'm pretty sure there are, considering how the beta behaved. Even if that's not the case, like, how are they going to stop new ones? Like, yeah, obviously some of the satellite network is still operational, but I just don't see it being completely functional. It's not properly staffed, and I don't know if they're going to be able to reinforce it very properly, considering like it just seems like space travel is still not viable right now. And so, like, when the staff up there inevitably runs out of supplies, who's going to run all that stuff? And then, like, even then, like, if the net is no longer perfect, like, stuff's gonna slip through eventually. The thing is, the beta R is relentless. It never stops. Like, that's part of what makes them so dangerous, is the fact that, like, every time you think you gain ground, like, they gain ground, like, it's every one step forward, 3 steps back kind of situation with the beta. So it's not good. And then, like, I also think they talked about how, like, the moon's orbit has changed, and I think that's because there's another massive gravity fluctuation on the Earth, and any change in, like, a satellite's bodies, like the gravitational forces on a satellite, especially a satellite that's in a perfect orbit like the moon is, like, it's a non-decaying orbit, or at least if it is decaying, it's decaying on such a galactic scale that, like, it won't be problematic for the Earth within the lifespan of the Earth and the sun. Like, the sun will destroy the Earth before the moon does. But when you have a second gravity well, and it is enough to potentially alter the moon's orbit slightly even, that makes me think that the moon's going to start being in a decaying orbit. And I could see that being the ultimate end. Is like, they do all this stuff, they fight as hard as they can to survive, and even if they find a solution that kind of works, I could see this story ending with this, like, oh, but the real truth is that the moon is going to crash into the planet because of the G-bomb gravitational anomalies. And, like, that's kind of the ultimate end, is that, like maybe that's what they're going to find. They're going to find Yuko's papers, and the ultimate finale, the ending of that story, is going to be that the moon essentially will crash into the planet and destroy everything. And that, like, all of this hope, all of this buildup, all of this determination of humanity won't be enough. It'd be a really sad end, but genuinely, it feels like it's about, like, it feels like what's gonna happen. Just because, like, the physics, like, there's a lot of indicators that are in hint to that. James, you can say it'll turn into Moonfall, the recent movie by Emmerich, where the moon is actually a Dyson sphere made by AI nanobots. You know what? Honestly, that might be nicer than the actual, like, moon being a giant, like, iron stone slag ball that just slams into the planet. Because, frankly, I haven't seen Moonfall. I really probably should. Like, I've heard good things, but, like, at least there, it feels like if Moonfall were to destroy the Earth, it'd be because, like, like, AI nanobots, like, that would be, like, derived by something that exists, like some kind of intelligence, even a basic intelligence. Like, they came from somewhere, you know, like, the moon crashing into the planet after the G-bomb uses is just essentially our own suicide. Like, that's so sad. Like, that, like, we just screwed up the planet so badly, and ultimately, like, from the minute we detonated the bombs, we doomed ourselves. Like, there's some existential, like, irony to that. And definitely would be an interesting idea to explore. And I definitely think is a, well, it'd kind of be fitting. It'd be really depressing, but it'd kind of be fitting after all the crap we've been seeing humanity putting itself through in these stories. Saw a good video about how the moon would just get shattered into a ring. It wouldn't actually hit the Earth. If it was knocked out of orbit, it would still devastate the planet. Kinda. It depends. There's a couple ways about that. You're talking about a moon that it's either tidally ripped apart or is shattered by a collision, where it fractures. Majority of the moon would stay orbiting in rings, but you would have a ton of debris, and the debris would likely have rocks that were big enough that it would essentially be an extinction event. What we're talking about here, though, is such a drastic change in core gravitational pull that the orbit of the Earth becomes a decaying orbit. It slows down, it becomes elliptical, and it slowly is going to fall into the planet as a whole. When the moon gets close enough where tidal forces would rip it to pieces, it would be already falling through the atmosphere at that point, and the majority of its mass would slam into the planet. Now, there would be a mass ejection after that fact that would devolve into rings, but we're talking about we're talking about a couple different scenarios. Like, that scenario, that YouTube video is talking about a scenario that is like, it's more status quo based, where like the nature of the Earth and the nature of the moon doesn't really change. It's just a fundamental change happens to the moon itself. This story is about like a gravitational anomaly on Earth, essentially giving it more gravitational pull. Essentially, you can almost imagine the Earth having two cores, each core having its own gravitational pull. I'm guessing that the G-Bomb one is softer than the main one, but it's still significant enough that it's pulled all the water to one side of the planet. And you think about it, the water moves, the tides of the water are created by the moon and the sun's gravitational effect on the Earth. So if we have a source of gravity on the Earth that is strong enough to pull like an entire ocean from one side of the planet to the other, that's significant. And if it's significant enough to cause the moon's orbit to be affected, you could have a slow descent. Like Phobos is a great example of that. Phobos is slowly decaying into Mars. Now, it's on the timetable of thousands of years, but that moon is going to crash into Mars. It's slowly falling into like Mars's gravity. It's essentially it's doomed to fall in. If we've screwed the moon into an orbit like that, it will retain its stability in that sense until it eventually comes crashing down. And then you have essentially, if you've ever seen the music video, what's it called? It's a really, really good one, and I can't remember what it's called. Gosh darn it. It's like the one that had the animated, like, music video that told the story about the little girl who was in the virtual, like, machine. It's gonna kill me because I know what it is, and I know I'll think about it in like 5 minutes, and it's gonna just be so obvious. But that shows a depiction very briefly that's a lot more accurate to what I would anticipate this scenario like evolving into. Where like it's mostly about like a solid decaying orbit, because like by itself, the Earth, even with a second gravitational well, in order for the moon to actually experience the tectonic shearing forces that would be necessary to fracture it like that, it would have to be so close to the planet, it would not matter anyway. Anyway, there's a lot of fun physics to talk about in there, but like I said, it kind of comes down ultimately to this being a very unusual situation where physics models would be very different from the ones that video would have talked about. But yeah, even so, like even if I'm completely wrong in this fact, it's still like I'm still fairly confident the Earth is screwed, and like I just don't see there being a good solution for it. Honestly, like I would not be surprised at all if it's just doomed. Anyway, we're getting pretty much to the end. I loved this story. I think it was wonderful. It was so much fun to cover it on the channel. I really fell in love with these characters as much as I've fallen in love with all the other Muv-Luv characters. I still think that as a series and as world building goes, Muv-Luv is still kind of king of the castle when it comes to my visual novels. I don't think Muv-Luv is flawless. Like, it definitely has its flaws, its shortcomings. There are things that other visual novels do that better than Muv-Luv. But when it comes to scale, when it comes to character design, when it comes to overall like invested, like my investment in the series, Muv-Luv still takes the cake. It's so epic in the true sense of epic, where like I saw someone once, like there's a great YouTube video called the Muv-Luv Experience where it's just a guy doing a rant about Muv-Luv, which is great. And one of his kind of jokes, well, semi-jokes, because I genuinely agree with it, he says that like Muv-Luv, like he compares it where he says like someday there's going to be like on his shelf he's going to have like the books like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, and Muv-Luv. Like these titanic, earth-changing stories. Like stories that maybe not everyone reads, but have the capacity to change your world and worldview. I absolutely think Muv-Luv qualifies. James, you say the solution, Takaru dies the time he resets October 2010. Yeah, that's fair. But like that thing, like we gotta remember though, really, like the really depressing thing is when in alternative, when Takaru jumps back home when he like decides to abandon things because he can't handle it. Remember how he brought all the baggage of continuity with him that ended up dooming Marimo and erasing the memories he made with people from the minds of those whom he loved. And he also even brought about the like near death and genuine like incapacitation of Sumika. Like when he decides to go back and Yuko is driving him back to like the research facility where she can like send him back to the alternative timeline he came from. She talks to him about it. She says like plainly, like, you've screwed this timeline. Like, we're gonna move on. You have to go back. Unlike like we can think of world lines like Steins Gate, that when Takaru like does his like re-wake ups, that he's like essentially resetting and erasing timelines. But Yuko kind of says no, that's not really what's happening, because the fact that he could dip into the extra timeline and had dipped into the extra timeline in canon, but that his return obviously wasn't canon to the extra timeline that we understood it as, where he like was being erased from the minds of his friends and everything, and Sumika got like critically injured. Like obviously that stuff didn't happen in extra, and she kind of says like, look, yeah, you kind of screwed this timeline, and that it's irreversible. But you can find a timeline that's better. That's essentially what she tells him. She's just like, look, you can leave, you can find and make things right for a timeline. Not this timeline, a timeline. So there's a pretty solid evidence to say that even when Takaru vanishes from this timeline continues on without him. In fact, that might be one of the coolest things that they'll actually talk about and cover in like the next installment of this, is I could see, like, it kind of implied that Takaru might be warping out of this reality shortly. Like when he's standing there crying, like after like the collapse of the jar. Some of you pointed out that like some of you believe that it wasn't Sumika that he destroyed there. But if it was, what if that's the start of the next story? That Takaru's standing there and he's crying, and then he vanishes, and that's him essentially being reset to the beginning of what we consider alternative. Like this is his last like walkthrough before he set off the alternative timeline, because he had fragmented memories of in alternative of what happens, but it's pretty clear in this timeline he's pretty beaten down, but that he also has some general understanding of like the entire like scope of what's going on. So it kind of makes sense that a Takaru from a timeline like this is the one that ends up being the one that kind of wakes up in alternative. So what if that's what this story really is? This is the timeline where Takaru goes back the final time, and so like he vanishes, and so we get to see what happens to a world that he vanishes from but continues on without him. That would be really interesting. So James, he's bringing back his own character for Riso because he feels more comfortable with them. Said characters are Takamura Yuri, Yuya Bridges from Total Eclipse. So you really do want to read Total Eclipse before Rezo releases. If it ever does, it's still up in the air. The anime bombed in sales, and the Gacha Immortals, it was a massive disaster. I wish I could play Immortals. Like, I'm a sucker for a few Gacha games. As long as they've got decent storyline and characters, like, I play the crap out of Fate Grand Order. I was really excited for Immortals. I hope they re-release it. In alternative, Takaru has PTSD that carried over from the Unlimited timeline. I wonder if we'll see what happens to him in Resident Evil. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. Like, I'm thinking that we're gonna see a Takaru who leaps out of Resident Evil, like the timeline of Resident Evil, like our Takaru just vanishes, and how like we might even see how at first there's like people like wondering like where'd he go, but then slowly as like causality kind of reassesses itself, that he just is forgotten by everybody. And then all of his like, what if like all of his achievements get attributed to Hibiki, you know? Because especially at like the Hive, Hibiki charged in with Takaru, but if they forget Takaru was part of the story because it gets edited out essentially, like what if Hibiki then becomes this like super pedestal person, like even higher, like he becomes Hibiki plus Takaru's achievements kind of stapled into him? Like, what would that do to him? That'd be interesting. So like that's my theory. My personal theory is that we're gonna see what happens to a timeline when Takaru leaves. So Sumika dies in this timeline, Takaru dissolves away and goes into a different timeline, essentially, like I would argue the alternative one, and we see what happens to those left behind. Because I think the worlds continue on without him there. It's like every time he's died, it's been a doomed timeline for humanity that is legitimately exists. And he and Sumika keep hopping because of her quantitative ability. She can kind of keep hopping him through until she finds a timeline that she finds acceptable, where the conditions meet, that she's willing to accept when she completes her mission, and she lets herself go and also lets him go. So it's a really interesting idea, and I think that's where they're going to go with this, honestly. Anyway, so regardless of that, we're getting to the point where we're just theory crafting at the end. Thank you so much for those of you who attended. It's really been fun. There's one last thing I have to cover before I really wrap this up, though, and that's Best Girl. I always have to do Best Girl. Now, I'd love to know what you think Best Girl is, because there's some fantastic candidates here. I'm going to eliminate Best Girl candidates who are heavily featured in other games. So, quote, Yui/Maya is off the table because she would kind of automatically win. She is Best Girl. And Yui's also Best Girl. Oh gosh. I have to admit, like, I really like Maya as a character, but Yui is also really good as a character. And like, I have to say, between the two of them in Altered Fable, Yui actually won, in my opinion. I played both of their like stories, and Yui's was definitely the more impactful. Like, I played through Yui's on my playthrough. I was crying in part of it. It was so beautiful. And Maya's is great. The Yui took the cake for me. So, I still can't decide between Maya and Yui which one I think is better. I genuinely don't know. It changes on the daily. So, but anyway, regardless of that, I'm just qualifying them because they're tangential to this storyline. We have a whole bunch of other characters to consider, and so where do they stand, and who do I think is Best Girl? Riviera is a very strong contender. Lilia is a great contender as well. Lilia is Kjellberg is fantastic. She's so good. No, not Yui and Yuhi. Yeah, there's difference. Like Yui and Yuhi, I'm meaning Yuhi. Like, I probably was just rushing it. I'm sorry. Apparently, I'm slurring them together. My bad. But so Riviera, top contender. Lilia, top contender. Fantastic characters. Very, very, very good. Yuzuka, fantastic. Honestly, between the three of them, I'm not sure if I could pick. But there was one person that I think was Best Girl above them all. And that was Ogami. I love Ogami as a character. She was so fun. She was so interesting. Oh, Marimo, she's also pretty top tier, but I feel like she's off limits for some reason. I don't know, man. But Ogami is my Best Girl. I mean, not only is she adorably cute, but I love her gung-ho attitude. And she definitely wasn't perfect, and it was horrible to see her fall so spectacularly during the fighting. But even post-fighting and in recovery, she still was that spunky, like, excitable, like, genuinely enjoyable character. So, she kind of takes the cake for me. Like, there's a lot of fantastic girls, and I think that's why, like, Best Girl for this series is definitely going to be a lot more divisive, because there's a lot of people and a lot of opinions. Now, I always say this, best girl for Hibiki, like Hibiki's best girl, I think is Yuzuka. I think the two of them were the best matchup. I'm really happy that they ended up together. I think it was the right one. Kind of like with Takeru, where like I liked Maya and Yuhi, but Takeru, I think, is better suited with Sumika. Like, I do think those two are better suited for each other as to the characters. Me, myself, I personally like them more. Same thing. I think Hibiki as a character is better suited with Yuzuka. But I think Ogami is my best girl. And it's really interesting. I don't know why. I can't, like, say one particular reason why she was so impactful for me. I think it was just a combination of her attitude, like the way she sees the world, and the way that she like also understood people and understood like good ways to help like them be better. She's a catalyst character, and I really just thought that she's really exciting, and I don't know, I really like her, and I'd love to see more about her. I'm hoping in the next sequel that we got to see like what does she do post recovery. I could see her kind of becoming more of a like coordinator role, very similar to Valkyrie Mom. James, you say, a shame that there's no TL of Oran Neki Natsutowa Naru Shirabe. It's the one I would translate if possible. It's extra if it happened in the beta verse. It's the Risoko's original VN. She had an entire VN of her own. Owa Naki is where Ritsuko came from. Yeah, see, I'd love to play that. That'd be so fun. She's a great character. Like, I'd love to see her and what shenanigans she gets up to in Extra. I also, like, I have to, like, I don't know, like, she's just, like, her character design is also just fantastic. I also personally have I've always had a draw to the more tomboyish kind of characters who also have, like, it's weird because, like, I like the tomboyish attitude, but the feminine, like, but still having femininity, like, and that's like Ogami's really good at that. She kind of gets the best of both worlds. So yeah, very strange, I know, but I know a lot of people won't agree, but she's my best girl. So yeah, she was wonderful. But yeah, there's a lot of great stuff, great stories that we still have yet to see translated. I really hope to play and cover in the future, but we are out of time. My voice is starting to give out. I need to go take a break. But mostly, I think this is a wonderful capstone to the day after. I look forward to being able to see the continuation of the story someday. I hope it comes out sometime soon, but I know that these things take time, and I'd rather get a good story in 10 years than have a crappy story in 2 years. So, wherever it comes from, or however long it takes, I hope they just keep translating, like, the, like, branching, like, Muv-Luv Universe stories that are still out there, like you're talking about. I hope we get to see those someday. Apparently there's also another one that's really, like, that's about, like, Isumi and her sisters, like that visual novel that takes place in Extra. Like, that would be another one that'd be really interesting to see, because I really was curious. I'd like to learn more about, like, Isumi's a fantastic character, and I'd like to know more about her sisters, because they were, the little we saw of them in, like, the Unlimited verse were really interesting, but I'd really love to know what that story's all about. But yeah, what a ride, man. This game, every time I came back to it, was exciting. Every episode was fun to record. Everything was fun to make and create and talk about. The biggest annoyance is the fact that, like, the new operating build that they did with these games that they're releasing now is obviously built to be mobile, like, friendly, but it doesn't mesh well with my audio card, and so I had to use my, like, personal headphones and not my surround sound headphones because they just gummed up everything. Oh yeah, Schwarzenmarken, absolutely. Like, that, I know that one is being translated though. Like, they haven't made an official announcement because it might fall through, but I have heard from credible sources that it is in the works. So, yeah, it's fun. It's written by a very different writer. Uchida, it's dark and brutal. Theodore's paranoid, angry butthole, MC who calls every member of his squadron a B. Yeah, YouTube actually flagged your message because of the swear words, FYI, but I was able to pass it through. But, like, just be careful. YouTube might, like, edit you out. Reflex. I don't know. This is what they do now. But yeah, Schwarzen Marken, if there is another game that gets translated, like that one's like next on the list. There's a lot of people who have been saying they want to see that translated, and there have been hints. Like, heck, even in Photon Flowers, one of the Easter eggs that I didn't really, I don't know, I don't think I showed it in a video, but when you finished it, you unlocked the trailer for Schwarzen Marken, and it was translated, like the trailer was. And like I said, I've heard from credible people that it is like in the works. It's just whether or not it gets properly finished and then delivered. You know, like projects can die on the working floor, and so since it's not officially announced, we don't know. But I can guarantee you that like it's very likely coming. And if we see something get released, I think it's the next one. The next announcement I think is going to be that one. But yeah, I've also noticed that they're a lot quieter now because not everything's gone swimmingly, as you pointed out earlier, with a lot of this like big push for Muv-Luv stuff. I think it's been successful. I just don't know if I think they overestimated just like how much pull they have over here, which is funny because they only have the fan base they have because of fans just begging them to let us translate it, you know? But like it hasn't had time to really like saturate in a market outside of those who are already dedicated fans, you know, kind of like how Fate is for a lot of for people like me, where none of the Fate stuff's been officially translated, but people have become fans of it because of fan translations and or just like seeing some of the properties like the anime. Like we became fans, but Fate could be so much bigger over here if they just freaking released the games and translated them properly. But it needs time to become that, you know? You can't just force it, and that's kind of what I think the Muv-Luv people were really trying to go for, was kind of forcing it through, and I'm just not sure it quite paid off, and I'm hoping that doesn't stop them. I hope maybe it'll just slow them down and make them, like, be more, like, meticulous. James, you say, the Schwartz anime is not good, it's short and ruins several characters, and the characterization takes a limited runtime of 12 books does. That's the problem with almost every anime that tries to cover this stuff. Like, this stuff is too story dense. Like, even Steins Gate. Like, Steins Gate was a successful anime. I think it did a great job of telling the story, but it still butchered the story. Like, there's so much that gets left out. These are... It's like trying to take a novel and make a movie about it. It's so hard to do right. There's only a few that have done it right, and I think one of like, the only ones I can think of is Lord of the Rings. Like, that's the only video... like movie franchise based on a long, deep book that's done it right. And like part of the reason why it was done right was because it was A, all filmed at once, and B, like even it wasn't theatrically released, but they filmed, edited, and polished like 3-hour and 3.5-hour versions of each movie that are fantastic to watch. But like all in all, like not just stuff that was filmed, but stuff that made it to like production of those movies, like put together, it's like a 14-hour experience. That's essentially what you'd need to cover a story like Muv-Luv, even remotely properly. And even then, that's a lot to ask. It's just not gonna happen. It's like you have to have someone who's willing to gamble a lot of money to make something like that. And I just don't see that being a thing. And so that's unfortunate. While this franchise is so good, it just does not translate to anime very well. I did hear, like, I've heard people say that they think the anime of Alternative was okay. Like, it was really rushed at the beginning, and I definitely think they were, like, not great at first. But the second half of the seasons, like the second season essentially, was really well done. They did a really good job with that stuff. So... there's hope, but yeah, it was rough. Anyway, Schwarzen Marken, I do think, is the next big title that they're going to announce the translation of, if they are going to announce more translations. I think Schwarzen Marken is more likely than actually seeing the follow-up story to this one, because that one hasn't actually even been published in Japan yet. I still think it's going to happen, though. I just think that we're going to see a translation of Schwarzen Marken before we have that, just because of timetables. Anyway, I really am getting really out of breath. So we're gonna end here, but of course we're gonna jump into the final thing. I always say, what are we covering next? I made a promise last year when we do polls every like December, January, where I poll the audience for the games that you're most excited to see on the channel. It kind of helps give me a guidepost as to what I should prioritize, just because there's so much good content to cover. I want to make sure that we can all be hyped. So I typically, like, I take my list of like, what am I most hyped up for that at that time. You guys help me pick the finalist. Anyway, sorry, James, real quick. The alternative anime had some of the worst 2D you've ever seen anime in years. It was really sad when it was airing alongside the new Gundam, which even outdid alternative with its own version of Chomp. Yeah, that's true, unfortunately. I'm guessing that it was hard to sell the Muv-Luv idea because they'd had so many tries with animes that were kind of flops. And so I think they went with if I remember correctly, they went with a new studio. And that new studio kind of like, they really tried to make the mecha scenes work. So they did a good job with those, but it meant that there was like no budget for anything else. So it kind of shows like where everything else was done really. But the voice work in the anime, to be fair, the voice work in the anime was fantastic. And the Chomp scene was actually really well done. It was pretty traumatic. It was very reminiscent of the PTSD. Really brought that back. Anyway, but last year I said, what are we going to cover on Monday, which is kind of like the long series portion of the channel, where like I put the really long narrative stuff. Because like I want Wednesdays to be a bit more fluid, and Fridays are going to be extremely fluid, but focused on like smaller or newer publications and newer like publishing and development companies. Wednesday is for established series that aren't super long, and Mondays for the big serialized series. And so I said, well, what's the thing we want to cover after Muv-Luv? And easy win was Higurashi and Omaneko. But those, like with how long I've been covering Muv-Luv, those are likely to dwarf. Like, we have almost 300 Muv-Luv videos at this point. Apparently, Higurashi and Omaneko are so big as series that they're probably going to be bigger. Like, there's probably going to be 400 episodes if we do it all, which I'm probably going to. So that's something I don't want to start lightly. Granted, I do think it's going to be fine if more Muv-Luv comes out. I might take a break from one of those and jump into Muv-Luv temporarily, kind of a thing. We'll see what we get, how we feel when that happens. But the question becomes, like, do I jump into Higurashi now and wait to do Total Eclipse later, or do I just jump into Total Eclipse real quick because it's available? Well, I did think about it a lot. I even talked to some of my to the patrons a little bit about it, and we kind of came to a decision. So I'm going to show the trailer for the game that we're going to be covering next, and I hope that you all enjoy it. And yeah, just kind of consider this my farewell and the explanation for what is coming next. It's not going to be super secret, but I'm just not going to say it. I'm going to let the animation speak for itself of what we're doing next. I hope you're as hyped as I am, because I'm really excited. It's going to be fun, and I'm already all set and ready to go to start next week. So it'll be next Monday starting out. But as for me, thank you so much for attending. Appreciate Kitfly and James Brown for your comments during this live. It was really fun having you here. Rick P1, sorry for that topic. You like 13 Sentinels against you'd like 13 Sentinels against Rim. It has a lot of interconnected plots. That's definitely on the list, but I actually recommend, because I haven't heard that from many people, go to the if you have other recommendations, anyone who's listening to this, go to the Discord. There's a VN recommendations kind of chat log, and it's a way for me to really kind of keep those lists together, because you can scroll back in the history, so like we don't lose track of it as easily. So I'd highly recommend just going in there real quick and just dropping that recommendation there as well, because this video is going to get lost in the playlists for me. And so, like, I'm grateful, and I definitely know I've looked at that, and I definitely think it looks interesting. So it's definitely on my list of like consideration. But put it in the recommendations, and it'll make it easier for me to remember. And if there's a lot of other like obvious support, it'll help me it'll help make it more likely to be brought up in the future. Because I always go there when I'm considering what to play next. Like I always look at that recommendations list and I scroll through it and I look at like what are people like, what am I getting multiple recommendations of, what am I getting a lot of responses for. So just keep that in mind. That's a great place to go post that. But thank you for your comment, Rick. It's good having you there. Thank you to everyone who posted comments. Thank you for everyone who's been part of this series. It's been really fun. But yeah, it's time for us to go. So look forward, of course. We got more videos coming out this week. Yakuza 0 has been really fun. Trails in the Sky has been amazing. We're still kind of in the starting points of rewrite. That's been really fun. And then Friday series is almost done, so we'll have a new one of that starting soon. But as for now, I'll see you all later. So until the next video, watching me, happy to see me next. I'll see you there. Enjoy the announcement of what we're covering next.